So good evening and welcome to the seventh Greater Woodbury Environmental Forum. My name is Ed Edelson, and on behalf of the Green Sanctuary and the Social Justice Committees of the Mattituck Unitarian Universalist Society, I'm pleased to moderate tonight's forum. Our aim is to basically raise awareness about the significant environmental issues we all confront, and this is in keeping with the principles of the Unitarian Universalist Society. And I'll just bring that up real quick here. But in particular, what we call our fourth principle, which is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And the seventh, which is even more relevant, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And if you'd like to know more about that, please feel free to visit the website www.uua.org. And like many religions, the Mattituck Unitarian Universalist Society is currently meeting virtually on Sunday mornings at 10:30 a.m. And you can visit our website at www.muusct.org or go to the Facebook page, which is found by searching for MUUSCT for more information. And I think you'll find the services that we hold each week quite inspiring. We couldn't do this without the support of the Connecticut Community Foundation. They've been good enough to give us a grant to do this as part of their ongoing commitment to improve the natural environment in the greater Woodbury and Connecticut area, which includes many of the towns that people here tonight are from. I would encourage each of you to write in the chat how you came to know about this forum, because that helps us when we do future forums to know how it is that we can reach people. So I think everyone knows that tonight our topic is a new vision of environmental learning. In my experience, it is helpful to have good environmental laws and regulations. It's important to have proper enforcement of those laws and regulations. And as we've witnessed in the past 4 years, it is essential to have leaders who care about the environment. However, of utmost importance is to have a citizenry that is educated and committed to the care of the environment. And without that commitment by people, the laws become just words on a bookshelf and enforcement will be half-hearted. As the implications of what environmental science predicted years ago and up until the current time, we have seen so many changes come about as predicted. And I think we have a challenge now going forward of what do we do to be better with our environmental education. So our speaker tonight has confronted all of these issues on how to educate and engage people in a deep conversation about the importance of the environment we all depend on. As an educator, author, and university president, my friend Mitchell Thomashow has been deeply involved in the evolution of the environmental movement since its onset with Earth Day in 1970. Many of you here are already aware of his prior books and are looking forward to his current views that are now available in his latest book, To Know the World, which has just been published by MIT Press. For those of you on Zoom from this area, the book is being stocked, if you will, at the Hickory Bookstore in Washington Depot. So they've told us they've ordered the book and it should be there soon. After Mitchell's talk for about a half an hour or so, he'll be joined on the panel by Ken Elkins and Abby Pecklow, two well-known local environmental educators in this area, and I'll introduce them when we begin the panel. On a personal note, as I already mentioned to some of you, I've known Mitchell since elementary school, where we had many, many conversations about environmentalism back then. Truthfully, I don't think either of us even knew the word environment when we were back in elementary school. But regardless of our ignorance back then, it is a real joy to introduce our speaker this evening, Mitchell Thomashow. And with that, I will try and spotlight you and remove mine. So Mitchell, whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Okay, well, I also have to very briefly let people know the origins of this. And when I was president of Unity College in 2006, they sent me to Connecticut on what turned out to be a fool's errand fundraising foray. And I was staying at a bed and breakfast. And I drove up and knocked on the door, and this guy comes out and he shows me a copy of the high school yearbook and pointed to a picture of me and said, "Are you him?" And I said, "I sure am." And it was just one of those wonderful coincidences, and we've been in touch ever since. Thank you so much to Ed for putting this together, and thank you so much to all of you for coming. I know we're all zoomed out, and being on the screen this way can be very tedious and can be very tiring. But I hope that I can enliven your evening a bit. One of the things that's wonderful about this for me is looking over the list of participants. I've got my friends from elementary school. I've got wonderful friends from the Keene area, colleagues from around the country, another university president who, by the way, has made it, Vim Vivell, who's at Lewis and Clark, who's done a tremendous job nationwide in helping campuses reduce their carbon commitment, and some faculty at other places. It's really a delight and joy to have all of you in the same place with me tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to screen share now, and let me get that going and because I'm going to show slides, so you don't have to be looking at me the whole time. But come to think of it, I don't think I need help. Here's screen share, and we want to go to this, and we did it. Can everyone see my screen and the slides? I assume yes. So. Everyone's yes. Muted, so how would I know?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, so I just have a new book that's out, and that's a very exciting thing. This will be my 5th book, but every time a book comes out and it comes in the mail, it's just wonderful, because you spend hours and hours and hours and days and weeks just looking at a screen or looking at a piece of paper and writing the words down and thinking about it over again and feeling good about it and then feeling terrible about it and just losing perspective and then regaining it. And then finally the book comes in the mail and you have a copy of it and hold it in your hands and flip through it. And it's really a wonderful feeling. And it's been a great joy for me to feel, the fruits of the labor in that sense. And so this is my first chance to really share what's in the book. And what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to go through a lot of material very quickly, which is kind of the way I teach. So, hold on to your seatbelts, really, because I'm going to fly. And I think that's fine. I'm going to be available for any questions you've got, or if there are resources you want to look more deeply into some of the concepts. But I want you to see the whole vision of the book. I want you to get a sense of what I'm trying to do here. And then I'm going to focus on some specific parts of it in more detail. So that's the agenda for the next half hour. I'm going to give you the whole full vision of what I've been thinking about, why this matters to me, why I think it should matter to you, and how we proceed from here. We are now, once we come out of this horrible, hideous corruption, as I like to call it, we're going to be engaged in an ecological, cultural, spiritual, and political reconstruction. I think that's the only thing that keeps us going right now. So this is an attempt for us to begin to think about that and how we move forward and how we work together to make this world flourish and to make it a better place. So the book has 9 chapters, and I'm going to go through each of these chapters just to give you a sense of what's in it, why I wrote the book, and what some of this material is all about. I'm going to go through it in this order, except Memory Forever Unfolding, the 2nd chapter, I'm actually going to deal with last, because I think it will have more meaning at that point in time. I'm going to spend most of my time on the middle of the book. The chapter is called Constructive Connectivity and then Migration, and you'll see why when I get there. But I'm going to give you the full picture, go into more specific detail in the middle sections, and then we'll open the whole thing up. I want to take you back in time to a little bit beyond when I first met Bob and Ed in 55, 56, and 57 to 1968. I was a freshman at New York University, and it was in the Bronx at the time. And we used to go downtown every Friday night. I'd go to the 8th Street Bookshop, and then we'd go down to the Cafe Agogo and see all the bands that were coming in from the West Coast and from England. But I used to love to go to the bookshop because, as you all know, there was no internet then. And the best way for a young mind to keep pace with everything that was going on is to look at the periodicals and look at everything that was coming, all the new publications. And one day I saw this book on the shelf, this Whole Earth catalog with a picture of the Earth on the cover. And, you know, to use the parlance of the time, it really did blow my mind. I picked the book up, I looked at it, and it was filled with these really interesting sections. It reminded me of the Things to Do book I used to have when I was a little boy, with connect the dots and coloring and all of that. But here it was tools to make the Earth a better place. And there were these different sections. I remember going through that book over and over again and reading a lot of the books that they referred to. And it was extremely influential. And in retrospect, a lot of my career, both as a university president, as a faculty member, as a dean, has been to try to find ways to reproduce this as curriculum on college campuses. And so this was a very influential book for me, and it really sparked my career. There are a whole bunch of us who have been inspired by this image of this magnificent swirling planet. And in the late 60s, there was really no place you could do environmental studies. There were a few forestry schools, but those of us who are in our 60s and 70s built this field. And we built the programs, and it's been reasonably successful in the sense that there's now academic environmental studies throughout the world, and we have sustainability programs, but still we haven't been as influential as we'd like to be. And what I'm trying to say in this book is that even though we now have a field, it's time for us to really challenge ourselves to move this field forward in all kinds of new ways. And that's what this book is about. In short, my belief for really my entire career and now has been that learning how to perceive global environmental change is the crucial educational challenge of our times. And these challenges include the 6th mega extinction, which is not discussed as much, but in fact, there have been 5 mega extinctions during the history of life on Earth, which is a period of time when over 60% of all the Earth's species perished. This is number 6, and we're moving real fast on it. Plunging declines in biodiversity, what I like to describe as rapidly changing atmospheric and oceanic circulations and biogeochemical imbalances. In short, this is the 21st century planetary emergency that we are all facing. And one of the sad things about the last 4 years, by the way, is that we're wasting our time dealing with this, when in fact, this is what we need to be dealing with. And we have to get at it. We're losing time and we need to move quickly. The thing is, though, for much of the history of environmental studies, with a few exceptions, which I'll get to in a moment, environmental issues have been dealt with on their own. But now I have to change that, trumped to some other word, by seemingly more pertinent issues, economic and social equity, healthcare, resurgent tribalism, violent conflict, and so on. And I think the challenge, the demand for the environmental field, and for all of us who care about it, is to show the connections between these issues and the ecological fate of the planet. And they're not always easily perceived. So the question I ask in the book is, what is the role of environmental studies and what is the role of the environmental citizen in making those connections more clear? So I want to pose 4 questions for you, which are also at the heart of this book and the heart of what I think should be everybody's work right now. And these questions come out of some conditions. And condition 1 is the rapacious exploitation of the biosphere and its life systems, and our educational challenges. How do we best communicate the necessity of ecosystem thinking? Condition 2 is the increasing disparity between rich and poor. The challenge, how do we promote economic equity and social justice in cultures of materialism and entitlement? Condition 3 is the apprehension concerning the integration and separation of global cultures. Our challenge is, how do we promote intercultural understanding and cosmopolitan thinking in the midst of nationalist responses and ethnic tribalism? And finally, condition 4 is violence, weapons, and terror compete with deliberation, diplomacy, and collaboration? How do we sell our differences through community democracy, compromise, and service in the midst of conflict, extreme behavior, and fear? If you're interested in condition 1, but you're not paying attention to condition 2, 3, and 4, then you're not being helpful. And I think if your main interest is any of the others, and you're not paying a close attention to condition number 1, you're not being helpful either. All of these are connected. All of these need to be thought about together. All of these need to be taught about together. And a lot of what I do is in this book is I present teaching opportunities and ways of thinking about this so that we can understand the convergence of the tides of change and why it's so important to understand that convergence. So some of the trends that impact the future of environmental learning are these, and we have to pay very close attention to them. One, the urban planet. If you look at any charts of urbanization on the planet, but between the time I was born in 1950 and now, 2020, the planet has urbanized at an extraordinary pace. And by 2050, the great percentage of people on this globe would be living in cities. So if environmental learning does not take that into account, it's also not being particularly helpful. The second big challenge is the challenge of cosmopolitan culture, and that is under siege right now. And it is a place where demagogues do their damage. So we have to think about what is the meaning of cosmopolitan culture. And I'm going to get into, in a moment, I'm going to look at the relationship between species migrations and human migrations and what it means to think about those things together. The third trend is ecological equity and social justice. This is the future of grassroots environmentalism. If you talk to anybody who's 30 or under and really understand who they are and what they're interested in, as I'm sure Sylvia will tell you, this is the challenge. This is the issue. It's front and centered, which is, by the way, the name of a grassroots environmental organization in Seattle. And then finally, fourth, we need to better understand information networks and the new cognitive orientations that they breed. This is a huge challenge. We don't completely understand it yet. And I'm going to go through all of this in the slides to come. So that really summarizes the tides of change, which is the third chapter of the book. And again, I'm just giving you a broad overview now so you can see the big picture. The fourth chapter is called the Anthropocene Blowing Your Mind. The Anthropocene is a word that was coined by geologists to suggest that we have now entered an era in which humans are impacting the planet as a geological force. So in effect, the idea of the Anthropocene is that it's a new geological era, and what's characteristic about it and significant about it is human agency and how it's changing the planet. It's a contested term. It's got a rich academic discussion. We don't need to think about any of that right now, but I think it's important to know the term. And I asked the question of the book, is the Anthropocene blowing your mind? By the way, my son is a graffiti mural artist in Tasmania, and I thought that this was a wonderful portrait of some of the challenges of the Anthropocene. Wonderful cartoon by Roz Chast, which is proof of life on Earth. But the fact of the matter is, if you were to think about the artifacts of the planet and the things that are being buried and what someone will discover about our planet, it's both pathetic and amusing simultaneously. So the Anthropocene really is our chance to reflect back on who we are and what are our ethical and moral obligations. But part of the challenge also is the speed of technology. And I'm very concerned that using screens as much as we do, and I talk about this a great deal in the book, breeds a kind of myopia where your focus is narrowed and you're not seeing the great big biosphere. And so there's got to be a way to balance all of the screen time with time where we're really engaged in thinking about the greater circumstances of our ecological origins. I picture some of these great scientists of the past, Charles Darwin, Alexander von Humboldt, who's on the upper right, not much known in America, but really one of the most important environmental scientists, Rachel Carson, and then George Washington Carver, who's also not particularly well known, but is really in many respects the father of sustainable agriculture in America. And it's all framed within all of these apps and things that create a technological infrastructure for how we think about human nature relationships. But I think as part of teaching and as part of learning, we have to very seriously understand how this impacts how we see the world. And one of the things that I suggest in this chapter is what I call the deliberate pause. And what I mean by that is finding ways during the course of your day to really engage in thinking about the ecosystem, other creatures that live nearby, other people that live nearby from an ecological point of view. And there are a lot of activities in the book that set up these deliberate pauses in the middle of a busy day in the city or a busy day wherever you might be. And I take you through some of my own challenges in that regard. Connected to this, and this, by the way, I've always been intrigued by the golden spike because, and this is a picture of the golden spike. Cindy and I, when we came back from Seattle several years ago, we went to Utah, Promontory, Utah, where you can see this golden spike. And this was the thread, if you will, that connected East and West. And when the railroad was connected, you had this extraordinary transfer of goods that went back and forth. By the way, the railroad itself is a fascinating history. It was filled with people borrowing money, corporate financiers who were lending money that they didn't really have. It was filled with corruption. It was filled with exploited foreign labor. So in many respects, this railroad history is one of the yet another kind of sordid aspect of the America that we really don't know. But I couldn't resist telling you about that. But the reason why I have this slide is because I'm fascinated by this notion of connectivity and how the railroad leads the way to the internet. And in our lifetimes, we have seen a different level of connectivity take place. Yet, there's very little discussion about how to teach about it. I've got granddaughters who are using the iPad, and their mom's a teacher, and there's some guidance about it. But it's changing the way they think in ways that are both positive and very negative. So I have a whole chapter that looks at what connectivity is, what networks are, what's the relationship between ecological and social networks. And it starts by asking readers to really think about the networks that surround them in their lives, starting with the ecological networks. And here are a few photos. On the left, you have dendritic drainage. On the right, you have tree roots, and then mycelium. Mycelium connect the entire forest. What we're beginning to learn about the networks that connect trees and other organisms in the forest is absolutely mind-blowing. And we know so little about it because just, to be candid, the number of bankers and lawyers outnumbers mycelial and soil scientists by probably hundreds of thousands to one. So of course we don't know about this, but we need to and we should because there's extraordinary wisdom in it. This is the migratory path of the city shearwater that circumnavigates the Pacific Ocean. Every species on Earth has some type of trip that it takes, but human history is filled with migratory pathways and networks of connectivity, and we're just not as aware of it as we need to be. Another photo of the extraordinary flyways, we were just talking about it before, and all the birds that are flying through right now. Butterflies migrate, bats migrate. It's really extraordinary. And of course, humans do. And if you expand the time scale, it gets even deeper and longer than that. Networks are fascinating as well because there's a whole new branch of ecology that focuses on networks and network theory to better understand ecosystems. And I'm not going to go into the details of some of these drawings, but these are basically portraits of all the interconnectivity in an ecological system. And depending upon how you assess this and analyze it, there's great learning to be had and to be made. And keep this photo in mind because I'm going to show you another one later on that's very interesting. So what I do in this chapter is I look at the relationship between ecological networks and social networks. And I get into some of the theory of social networks and talk a lot about the notion of homology, which essentially means that people tend to congregate in like-minded networks. And it takes a very special person who can be the node in a network of networks. That is, people who are connectors. Yet we don't teach that. And we can start teaching that at the earliest elementary level and certainly through high school and college. How do you become a node in a network? We have good research that suggests that organizations, businesses, scientists who can function as nodes and networks are way more innovative and creative. So what I do in this chapter is look at the relationship between social and ecological networks and think of ways to make them more constructive, hence the name of the chapter is Constructive Connectivity. And this leads me, I want to do a very quick time check here. 7:25, okay, go back here. So, that's good, we're fine. I want to focus on migration because migration to me is the seminal environmental issue of our time. And it will be the seminal issue of generations to come. And we see it in so many different ways. And what's so disturbing about the last 5 years is how migrants have been demonized. And this is not only true here, but it's been happening all over the world. And as I say, the demagoguery of leadership that focuses on excluding migrants is deeply disturbing to me. Because the fact of the matter is, this is our future. And it's our future not only in terms of displacements between countries, but also displacement within countries. So you look at the wildfires and you look at the hurricanes, where are these people going to go? This is a major challenge for us, and it's only going to get worse as time goes on. And a lot of these displacements, by the way, are ecological displacements. They're a result of climate. And there might be political actors who, for one reason or another, take advantage of it for their own purposes. And sometimes these migrations are a result of politics. It's very complicated. I go into it in great depth in the chapter. But the fact is, we're made to think that somehow migration is something that's bad or something that's evil or something that needs to be stopped. But the fact of the matter is, there's always been human migration. That's what we do. That's why we're interested in the moon. That's why we're interested in Mars. We migrate. Here's a map of world migration since 1500. We could spend a whole hour just looking at this and thinking about it and what it means and how it happens. There's the global journey of humans out of Africa and taking over the entire world, essentially, in not a very long period of time. Only in tens of thousands of years did we go from Africa, and barely made it out, by the way, and then wound up settling the entire globe. This shows you the incredible flow of people between different places on the planet. And somehow we're made to think like the biggest flow is between North America and Latin America, but sorry, no, that's wrong. There are major migrations that happen all over the world in all kinds of places that you've never even heard of. And there are many reasons for this, reasons of work, reasons of displacement, but migration is a fact of life. It's a fact of the biosphere. It's a fact of evolution. It's a fact of adaptation. So what we need to do is we need to understand how migration can be thought about in ecological terms as well as in human terms. And I'm going to talk briefly about that in a moment. I'm showing you this because there's been so much really good thought about the problem of internal displacement as well as external displacements. And I can, for anyone who's interested in learning more about this, I can refer you to the websites and I can refer you to the literature that would be most helpful for you. This great work that's been coming out on migration, Sonia Shaw's new book, The Next Great Migration, looks at ecological migrations and species and human migrations. Isabel Wilkerson, whose great book, Cast, was preceded by The Warmth of Other Suns, talks about America's great migration, which is the African-American migration north. And then a recent National Geographic profiles a world on the move. So this is the issue. This is what we're all going to be thinking about. We're already thinking about, although we're very distracted now by the election, and reasonably so. And there are all kinds of agencies that are doing this work as well. In the book, I have a couple of sections where I look at activities, ways of thinking that can get you deeply engaged in thinking about migration in your community, both from a human perspective and from an ecological perspective. Every chapter is filled with personal experiences. Every chapter is filled with activities that are great for the classroom, great for the community, or great for all kinds of circumstances. So the big challenge in better understanding this is having tolerance for a cosmopolitan culture. And this has been very difficult to do for a variety of reasons having to do with tribalism and the evolutionary origins of tribalism, which I also get into in the book, but I won't get into now. And I don't want to say that having a cosmopolitan culture is easy, because it's not, but it can be done. And there are examples of it being done. And there are examples of people working together all over the world, people from different cultures, different generations. There are examples in this country, there are examples everywhere, but we don't hear about them because the airwaves have been dominated by you know who and his discontents. But the fact of the matter is there are really great projects going on. And it's our responsibility to be part of them and to highlight them. North America, prior to European settlement, was a very cosmopolitan place. Here's a wonderful map that shows you some of the culture groups and some of the languages that had trade and had flow between them. And that's not to paint some kind of rosy Pleistocene picture of harmony and peace. No, there were conflicts and there was suffering. But this was a truly cosmopolitan culture that preceded European settlement. And if you look at this amazing map of New England where we live, you can see all the different varieties of ecological landscapes, and there were cultures that corresponded to this, native cultures. So this is part of our history, it's part of who we are, and we need to understand it in a much more profound way than we do now. The sixth chapter is cosmopolitan bioregionalism. Bioregionalism is a term that emerged in the late 70s and early 80s. And the basic idea is that ecological criteria should determine political jurisdiction. So for example, where I live in Southwest New Hampshire, we're separated from Vermont by a river. And it makes no sense that New Hampshire and Vermont would have separate jurisdictions because in fact, the river is the watershed that ties these states together. So the idea of bioregionalism is that you recreate boundaries and borders, and I get into this a lot in the book as well, so that you rethink politics and economics as well. And this is a wonderful map that shows a future bioregional North America. And in the book, I spend a lot of time talking about how bioregionalism can work in cities as well, and how cities are a way of thinking about both cosmopolitan culture and different local ecosystems. So here are some rules of thumb that I think are very important to keep in mind when we think about networks, connectivity, cosmopolitanism, and migration. One, planetary urbanization contributes to a vibrant cosmopolitan culture. We have good research that suggests that cities are centers of innovation precisely because they're cosmopolitan. Global cities include people from a great variety of cultural backgrounds. Some arrive there by virtue of choice and opportunity, but others arrive as a consequence of displacement, refugees from war, political upheaval, or environmental change, especially climate. How do people from different backgrounds learn, live, and to work together? Now, there's going to be a time in the future, in our children's future, or our grandchildren's future, where the places that we live, let's say Northern New England or the Pacific Northwest, which currently aren't dealing as well, the Pacific Northwest has certainly dealt with the fires, with climate change as much as other places have, that are going to be places that lots of people are going to want to move to because they're going to be reasonably safe in some regard. So what are we going to do? How are we going to let people in? How are we going to choose to do that? What does it mean? My belief is that everything you need to know about a community, you can learn by the basis of how they deal with newcomers. There, by the way, is a wonderful book called The Newcomers about a high school in Denver that teaches refugee children and the heroic men and women who do that great work. Ecological urbanism can be very beautiful. These are a bunch of Hundertwasser, one of my favorite painters, the artistry that can take place in cities. Ecological Urbanism, a book called Ecological Urbanism that profiles amazing projects that are happening all over the world. But if you're watching MSNBC or reading Washington Post or the New York Times or whatever outlet that you're looking at, you're not going to see these stories because they're consumed with something else. But what I'm trying to say to you is there is also great works that are taking place, and we need to find them and highlight them and do something about them. I'm very intrigued by the whole notion of place and how we learn about it, but then more importantly, how we connect our place to other places. This is from an art exhibit in Hobart, Tasmania, where they asked people from Hobart who are now living all over the world to do a little patch, a little map about their place and how that place connects them back to Hobart. These are the kinds of things we need to be doing in our classrooms. So finally, I'm going to end with a discussion of the final several chapters. And these chapters are really about teaching techniques and ways of being on the planet. And one chapter is about improvisation. And how do you think on your feet? Because we live in a world where things are constantly changing. Adaptation is about change. And how do you improvise through all of this? And there's a great deal to be learned from music and dance and art. I think that the biosphere itself is this exquisite improvisational evolutionary system that's had, several billion years to work itself out. There's a section on the book in which I look at the brilliant and wonderful ancient I Ching, which to me is a biospheric knowledge system. And I imagine what it would be like if you took those biospheric archetypes and you use them as ways of thinking about climate change and other changes that are taking place and derived wisdom from them. Again, I'm not going to go into detail. I'm just trying to give you, a basic idea of what's in this thing. And the final chapter of the book is what I call perceptual reciprocity. And what I mean by that is that I think that everything on this planet perceives. I think landscapes perceive, I think other species perceive, but we're clueless for the most part. I mean, there are people like Brian Hagenbush, who's with us here as an entomologist, and he's really tuned into insects, and there are people who are tuned into mushrooms, and Ken Elkins is turned into birds, and those of you who I don't know are probably you're tuned into your pets, and you're turned into all types of species, but we have so much to learn from other species. Check out the new Netflix film, the Learning from an Octopus or something like that. I forget exactly what it's called, but we have so much. And so the challenge for us as environmental learners is how do we open ourselves up to this notion of perceptual reciprocity and how much we have to learn from the planet and from other species. This is all artwork that my son has done in situ, in place, in various outdoor settings in Hobart, Tasmania. And the main theme of this final chapter is, I love this. I'm not advocating for the use of psilocybin, but this is a wonderful diagram that appears in Michael Pollan's great book, How to Change Your Mind. And on the left, you have the normal relationships between different parts of the brain, of course, heavily stylized. And on the right is you have the synapses during a psilocybin experience. Now, Pollan writes about what he calls the entropic mind, and it comes from scientific research. And so the challenge is, how do you open the mind up in such a way that more of these connections can happen? So this is also connected to that ecological networks diagram I showed you, without really literally freaking yourself out. And I'm wondering how environmental learning can open up the same ways of thinking and the same ways of reacting, because I know it can. And I know those of you who are teachers, when you have students in outdoor settings, they open up in ways that are truly remarkable. And I think we can open up in the same way to people from different cultures and people from different generations and people from different ethnic backgrounds. It's all part of the same opening process that's so necessary for learning. And finally, one or two more slides, which are a little bit more personal. The second chapter is called Memory Forever Unfolding, because one of the interesting things about writing this book at the age of, well, I was in my late 60s, I'm 70 now, is you can remember back to the 50s and 60s. And there are things that you can say about your life as you remember it that may be of some interest, hopefully, to other people. And what I try to do in the book is I try to balance, and I discussed this early on, adaptive learning, which is how we find a path through the changing flows and circumstances of our social and technological encounters, with perennial learning, which is awareness of the wisdom of the ages. So in many respects, this book is a way to modulate those relationships. I'm very moved by Gary Snyder's great notion, the present moment that lives on to become long ago. And I use a couple of experiences from childhood because these were my first great learning experiences that have stuck with me for the rest of my life. And here's pretty much where I'll conclude with about 3 or 4 more slides. I read Harold and the Purple Crayon when I was very young. I was reading at a very early age. And what I remembered about this book throughout my life is that, Harold's tired and he draws his way, which is a form of improvisational learning throughout the world. And then he gets worried. He doesn't know where he is anymore. And he tries to find his way home. And he remembers that in his bed, he could look out the window and there was a moon just outside the window. And when he draws that, he can find himself safely home. So for me, this is the moral of this story is you've got to know your place. You've got to know your place really well. And from there, you can spread out and explore the world, knowing that you've got your place to come back to. The second thing that was incredibly influential to me was the Golden Guide to the Stars. My parents took me to the Hayden Planetarium, and I got this little book, and I was blown away by, wow, do I really live in this universe? And there was a whole stack of these golden guides, by the way. I eventually wound up getting all of them. And but this also was terrifying to me because on the one hand, I understood that my life was meaningful. On the other stand, it seemed meaningless. And this was my first excursion into existential dread, if you will, as crazy as that sounds. And but the reason why I mention it is because if you look at things like environmental learning, you are going to go to some dark places. It's not all going to be a celebration of life, but it's all about the balance between these two. Because also when I was 5 years old, the fog man used to come through the neighborhood. And I don't know, Ed or Bob, if you remember this, and they'd spray DDT. And we'd go, oh, great, the fog man is here. And I'm thinking about my love even of nature at that point. And wow, we can run through a fog. But we were running through DDT. So I talk about that as well. And interestingly enough, when I did this presentation just about this section of the book to some NYU students from around the world, they could all relate back to some type of toxic experience that they had when they were very young kids. So it's all about balance, perennial learning, adaptive learning, balancing the existential dread of the circumstances of our planet with the celebration of life, balancing our place with other people's places, balancing understanding environmental situations with situations that are political and economic and social and cultural. So the final slide here is just to let you know that the book is filled with ideas and activities for any age group, for any individual. And here are just a few of them that come from the appendix. And that is all I have to say right now. And I think that's more than enough.
All right. Well, Mitchell, if you could unshare the screen and we'll bring back some faces here. I think at the top of your screen, you need to unshare.
Did it. Thank you for
Right.
the.
All right. And I think that some people might have had a little bit of trouble with some of the audio, but I think it did come back. So my guesstimate here, this book is about 5,000 pages long. Is that
No,
right?
it's only about 220 or 230, you know, you got to be pithy.
Okay, well, you've set yourself up with a challenge. So the next part, what we wanted to do was, you know, my understanding of Mitchell is he takes the broad view about environmental education. But like so many things, what's really important is where the rubber meets the road, where people who are really talking to let's say, the rest of the folks in the world who might not have environmental concerns at the forefront. How do you engage them? How do you educate them? How do you take this kind of perspective and try and make it real? And that's why we invited two of our local educators here, people involved in environmental education. Some of you know, and if you haven't met, if you live here locally and you haven't had a chance to meet Ken Elkins, who is now, I'm going to get the term wrong, and I'm still absorbing all the things that Mitchell said, but I've known Ken as an educator at the Bend to the River, but I now know his responsibilities are statewide to work with schools, school children, adults, people of all ages, and talk about education. So I'm going to first ask Ken to speak for a few minutes and reflect on what he heard in Mitchell's talk, and then we'll turn it over to Abby to say a few words, and then hopefully the three of them can interact a little bit. So I think to do that, Ken, I've got to find you somewhere out here.
If I speak, I might highlight a little bit quicker.
Yeah, give me a hint. Keep talking.
There
we go.
I was going to say, thank you, Mitchell. That was, I'd seen some of your notes, but it all came together a whole lot better tonight. So thank you for sharing all that I do better with hearing and visuals than I do with reading it myself. So first of all, the idea that Audubon and other groups, we do try and reach a lot of children, it's because the school groups need support from someone. And that's what Abby's organizations that she works with and Audubon, we can provide that. But we also have a lot of other ways that we try and find those nodes, those other parts of networks, and connect. And I saw one of my colleagues popped on tonight, Eileen Fielding from the Audubon Sharon, and it brought up a different idea, is that there's a lot of people that are going about and not thinking about wildlife around them until something happens, a little mini tragedy, and it's a window, it's a bird hitting their window. And now what do we do about it? And they find out that they can bring it to the Audubon Sharon Center. And while we're taking that bird from them, and hopefully the wildlife rehabilitators will be able to help that one individual bird, we also have thought about the fact that we now have a new audience and a new member of the community that could be a partner. So providing them some other information about what Audubon does and what else they can do to help birds, it gives us that, we need the why of why people want to participate when they have all those other things that you mentioned, that there's so much other noise in the media and there's fear about all those things going on in the media, that there is one way you can take control, and having that control of your own personal environment around you, that making your home more bird friendly is one of the messages that Audubon's been sharing a lot. Thank you, Mitchell, for saying that there are great projects out there and that we should all try and be a part of them. And it's a matter of how do we communicate about them? It's a big part of our meetings is how do we get the word out about what Audubon's doing or what some of our great partners are doing, that we have other land trusts that we're working with and training them on how they can make their lands more bird friendly as well, is that but we need volunteers on both sides. That are things that we're always thinking about. And the idea of bioregionalism, I think some of our nonprofit leadership has heard that, and at least here in New England and in New York, we have a switch to RCPs, Regional Conservation Partnerships. So for example, we have the H2H, that from the Hudson to the Housatonic River. All the major nonprofit groups have got, environmental NGOs are getting together so that we can think about the fact that a dotted line of 3 or 4 states has divided us, but really we can work together because that's how our ecosystems that we're trying to cherish the most are working together. So if you, and we are even doing that on a local scale for Woodbury, Southbury, Roxbury, our local neighborhood, that we have a small regional conservation partnership forming between Audubon and I'm gonna forget a partner or two, the Pomperaug River Watershed Coalition and Steep Rock Preserve is that Brian is with, and the Roxbury Land Trust and the Southbury Land Trust. We're all trying to combine together that we can have a larger voice when we are able to share, and the birds are and the wildlife are all moving between all of our different properties. So it was great to hear those themes, and that we do have some local examples for our audience tonight that they can be a part of those organizations if they weren't aware of them before tonight.
Okay, Ken.
So thanks.
I was going to ask Abby to make a comment or two, and then Mitch, then we can reflect on or you want to break in right now?
Just, yeah, because it's so fresh. I just want to make one comment on what Ken was saying, if that's okay.
Yep.
You know what would really be interesting, Ken, if you could do this? There is, there often is great interest in bird migration or butterfly migration. If you could find a way in some format to show the relationship between butterfly migration between Mexico and the United States and human migration, that the butterfly makes a very dangerous and challenging journey over multiple generations, and that humans make that journey too. And I'd love to see Audubon societies and organizations like that begin to you can do it without being political, but you can begin to ask people to trace the human journey as well as the butterfly journey or the migratory bird journey, and show that the dangers are parallel. So anything that you can do to meet that challenge, I think will make a huge difference in the future.
All right, well, if we could, we'll bring Abby in. And Abby is the Director of Community Education at our regional, I guess it's a Regional Education Service Center, right?
Close enough.
Something close enough, okay, known as Ed Advance, which really supports all of our public schools here in the kind of Northwest area with programming that goes beyond what an individual school or school system might be able to do. So a lot of leveraging that Abby is able to do with her relationships with all of the public schools. So with that as a very brief introduction, and Abby, you can feel free to add to that to explain your perspective. What were your reactions and thoughts as Mitchell walked us through his book?
Well, I really wanted everybody on the program tonight to know what our students are doing and what our educators are doing to support everything that Mitchell is talking about. I feel like this has been a very upbeat and positive evening of knowing what we teach our children. I do want to comment, Mitchell, that in my programs, we do mention the journey that people take. But tonight I realize we have to do a much better and in-depth job of that. We do that to help students make cultural connections. So when we speak of, let's say, countries in Central America where birds might be migrating, we call to attention that a lot of the students in our group are also from Central America and they migrated as well. But I do want to say that we have the Whole Earth catalog on our bookshelf. And we also have the Whole Earth epilogue on our bookshelf. So my husband's been keeping those since 1968, I guess. I did want to just start, because it's important, to acknowledge with gratitude the indigenous people who inhabit the land where we live before our arrival. Environmental educators, we think, in Connecticut should want to have place-based experiential learning. So we offer field trips whenever is possible. We use real scientific supplies and gear. We want our students to feel like they are scientists. We are interested in giving truthful historical and cultural background information when we talk about the place that we're at. We also share about and respect diverse users. So for example, if we're at the beach, we talk about people who go to swim, but we also talk about fishers, and we also talk about people who use boats and people who want to preserve bird sanctuaries. So we present the information in an unbiased way, and with giving truthful information, we hope that students will make those connections and make decisions for themselves that are in the best interest of our environment. We encourage equity and inclusion with intentional participation of underserved, marginalized, and non-white youth. We think that environmental educators should talk very little and let students explore freely, get dirty, cold, and wet, run and roll around, rather than walk quietly in a straight line. And we think that students should do instead of listen. We hope as environmental educators that the work that we actually do inspires students to go outside, learn more about their natural world, care deeply. We want to help move them from environmental awareness to action. We want to encourage them to make behavioral changes that will improve the environment. We hope that they'll share with others what they learned. And we also, very importantly, want them to explore options in higher education and career paths in the field of environmental education. In order to do all this, we need funding. That's always the hardest part. We have to work hard to develop friendships, develop partnerships, as Ken was saying. We do need to work closely with classroom teachers and school administrators. That's always a challenge, to be honest. And we want to help bridge to extended classroom learning and stewardship projects. So with all this work, I just want to share that I'm the director of two state organizations that work with youth and teachers, COEA, Connecticut Outdoor and Environmental Education Association, and also Connecticut Greenleaf Schools. And both of these statewide organizations work very hard to ensure best practices with environmental education and pushing forward the messages that Mitch shared today. And I think I'm going to skip my photos of the students because I think it's getting late, but I thought if I had the opportunity, I would show you how our kids learn. Ed, do I have a minute to show?
Yeah, no, I think we're still good for time. I mean,
Okay, let's
maybe I'll find out everybody left the Zoom meeting, but I think we're still, have most people are sticking with this.
Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm showing you some pictures because I want you to feel really inspired about how kids learn best in the environment. The boys in this picture are getting ready to go seining. It's a freezing cold and raining day at Long Island Sound, but they are thrilled to be wearing their gear, and they are thrilled to be using a seine. And right here, you see some of the students in the water, all smiles, as you can see. Kids do get dirty. They measure fish on our board, and they examine them close up. People, young people, girls especially, who start out screaming that they don't want to touch any of the fish, are the first ones to get their hands dirty. We feel like that's a life-changing day for them. These are students who are learning firsthand about bird banding, and they are actually, in both of these situations, are being invited to release a bird that's being banded by our ornithologist. Our kids, I especially, we believe that students make wonderful teachers, and we encourage our students to teach others about the environment. In this case, in this photo, students have spent a lot of time learning about birds, and they all wrote ebooks, electronic books. They made up stories based on truth about birds, and they're reading them on their laptops to younger students. And these students in Danbury are teaching all about gardening, and this is a garden that they have at their middle school in Danbury. These are kids who are teaching their entire school. I spent all lunch waves with these middle school students in Southington. They taught students how to separate their lunch tray. So that was a very powerful day. I was there for a day. They were here for a week. And every day they reminded students how to separate their trash to reduce waste. And these are students who are very proud to get their Connecticut Greenleaf School banner because they are the leaders in their school. This is their principal, their teacher, a few parents, but they are the leaders in taking charge of making their schools more sustainable and green. So that's all that I have. Thank you. And thank you for Mitchell for your inspirational speech.
So Mitchell, any response to what Abby and or Ken had to say?
It's all good, and it's great that you're doing this work. And Abby, thank you for including all that you did. I think it really filled in a lot, and it's another example of some of the wonderful work that's taking place in our communities.
Well, having said that, I mean, can you all three reflect on how effective is this with adults? What I mean is these children start out, and I've seen this, where they seem, very engaged in the environment and some of the things Abby's talked about, but to play a little bit of devil's advocate, they get older, they get a job, they all of a sudden the materialism of having things becomes ever present, and a lot of pressure to have more. Are we seeing any metric, anything that says we're making progress in terms of this becoming lifelong understanding and commitment to these ideals?
Ed, what I meant to do to close my talk was to read the very last paragraph of the book. And I'm going to do that now as a response to your question. Perhaps the best way to enhance environmental learning is to spend time with the extraordinary people who devote their lives to these expressions of generosity. You will find them everywhere, in cities, in the most remote countryside, in the diverse habitats and ecosystems of the earth, representing every conceivable age group and ethnicity. They're working on sustainable solutions, anti-poverty strategies, urban ecologies, human and ecosystem health, intercultural understanding, peace and justice, gender equality, LGBTQ issues, animal welfare, and wilderness preservation. You can make a list of good causes and organizations as long as this book, and you can enter their names in a field guide to human generosity that will entail volumes more. These are the heroes of our times. They are working together against formidable challenges. to understand the tides of change and promote solutions filled with kindness, compassion, empowerment, and generosity. They are the contemporary capstone of planetary environmental learning. They live in your neighborhood. They work on these projects every day. They have been doing so for generations, and they are most probably you. So in answer to your question, I think that there are people of all ages who are doing this work, but they might not identify themselves as environmental educators. There are so many essential workers. This is personal, but our daughter is a third grade teacher in Seattle schools. She's got two of her own kids who are 8 and 2. She's got 2 stepkids. They live in a very tiny house because that's all they can afford in Seattle. She had to completely overhaul and redesign how she does her teaching because it's all online now. So she's up to 11 or 12 at night because she understands that teaching online is completely different than teaching in person. She's got to nourish all these kids. When there are kids who come from communities that don't have the same resources, she's the one who has to get them the resources. She's the one who's got to connect them. And meanwhile, she's got her own kids and she's got her own stepkids who are in high school to take care of too. She's an essential worker. She does it amazingly well. She's not asking for anything in return other than good common sense. You multiply her by hundreds of thousands of people all over the world who may not be environmental educators per se, but are doing this kind of great work. And that's what we need to know. And that's what we need to hear about. So if these kids grow up that way, great. If their parents learn about this, great. I think the most important thing, and I think Ken and Abby just brought this out as well, is to make sure that every time you think about a natural history relationship, as crucial as that is, you also expand that to understand the depth of human relations and the challenges that we face. If those things are connected, then you'll go a long way with people. And that's why I say we have been, what has gotten me more upset than anything the last 4 years is how distracted we've been. And I get understandably, because we're just dealing with this guy and all his craziness. And we've got all these amazing people out there who don't care about right or left. They want a better life for their community. That's all they want. I know this, I'm out there. I've profiled communities. They don't care about the politics, they want better lives. And people like Ken and Abby and many of you who are, I'm sure, are here, that's what you're doing, and that's what you're doing all the time. And it's our job to highlight those people and make their voices come to the forefront. That's what mentoring is. That's what good education ought to be. And it's great, Abby, that you've got the kids teaching each other and teaching the other kids, because it's their voices that need to be heard. That's my rant for now.
I thought it was a good rant. Ken or Abby, any other comments, observations about Mitch's, let's say, thesis? And that's okay if not, we can open it up to everybody else, but I just
wanted to echo the importance of student voice and choice, because that is how those young people are going to grow up to take responsibility. If you don't give them voice and choice, they're just going to follow what came before them. So critically important.
Okay. Well, at this point, I'm gonna bring everybody else in. What I'd like to ask people to do, if you want to either ask a question or a comment, if you could just indicate that in the chat, and I'll try and call on you, so we don't have everybody sort of, we don't want it to be like a presidential press conference where all the reporters yell out at the same time and we try to figure out whose voice was loudest, because I hate that. But if you have a comment you'd like to share, please let us know, or let me know. Let's see, did I do that right?
There's another thing that we could do, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but Sylvia, if you're still with us, I'd love it if you could tell folks what you do in Seattle?
Okay, yeah, I'm still here. I'm just very cozy, so I turned my video off. But if you all don't mind, I will turn it back on. Also, there's TV on in the background, but I'll turn it off. So what do? I'm in Seattle, and I'm the co-president of E3 Washington, which is an affiliate of the North American Association for Environmental Educators. And I also work for a nonprofit called Sound Discipline, but the name is changing soon. So like pretend you don't know what the name is, I guess. But what we do is we help, we teach young people social emotional things basically so they can understand how to be in charge of their own nervous system, which is actually an environmental justice issue in my opinion, because a lot of the young people that I work with are usually have experienced trauma, and a lot of the trauma that they've experienced, kind of like what Mitchell was talking about, is it can be ecologically influenced, but then also that ecological trauma often is intertwined with political politics that oppress and marginalize people based on their identities. So in my work at E3, I basically work to right now my big focus last year, which was 2019, I think, was helping the organization itself grow from being like a historically white-led and pretty making a lot of mistakes, like organization, into a place that was more stable. So that was like financially, we used to be in a lot of debt. Now we're not in a lot of debt. People used to feel really offended, like people of color and other kinds of marginalized identities, by some of the stuff the organization was doing. So we've started to be accountable to those communities. And so this year, my big focus was on making that accountability go bigger and outward. So we're working on increasing our communication systems and networks to increase access to networks, especially for Black and Indigenous and people of color and other marginalized identities as well, people who are usually excluded from environmental education communities and circles. And then in my work at Sound Discipline, I help, I also, besides teaching social emotional learning, I help school leaders redesign their discipline systems so as to kind of like uproot structural racism and other kinds of marginalizations and create more equitable systems for responding to different kinds of behaviors in the classrooms. And it's all based on the idea that behavior, I think in this like puritanical American culture, we have this idea that if you don't like the way someone is behaving, then you have to make them feel really bad about it and then they'll stop. And that's actually completely unscientific. And so it's totally based in this like puritanical BS, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, sorry. But so the idea basically is that we use neuroscience to inform our practices on helping people to, like people as young as like 3 and 4, be masters of their nervous system and therefore more mindful with their behavior. So that I wasn't really ready for that. So that was all just kind of a vomit of what I do, but that's what I do.
Well, thank you, Sylvia.
Well,
we did have
that was great.
We did have a comment from David. I think he had a question about bioregionalism or cosmopolitanism.
Yeah. So Mitch, thank you. Thank you for including me. So profound as always. So in one of your previous books, Bringing the Biosphere Home, you wrote about the importance of a sense of place. And you talked about that, mentioned it briefly here, but so I'm wondering the sense of place vis-a-vis a world that is cosmopolitan and filled with people moving from place to place. How do we nourish our sense of place when we're so transient?
Right. That actually, I cover that at great length in the previous book, Bringing the Biosphere Home, because I'm very concerned about transience, and I actually look at as a Jew, I look at the Jewish diasporan tradition, because on the one hand, you could still find a place in community, yet on the other hand, place can go awfully wrong if it becomes a misplaced badge of honor. It's a very thin line that separates pride of place and a kind of nationalism that represents what Gary Snyder once described as the grinning ghost of a lost community. I think that there's a section in the new book called Why Place Matters, and I think place still does matter. The challenge though is that the question you have to ask is, how do I become a part of this place? How do I become a member of this community? How do I belong? You know, Running Grass, who's also here, did a wonderful talk at the Harris Center earlier this weekend in which he talked about the relationship between belonging and otherness. And I learned a lot from that comment. And so really the challenge here is, what does it mean to belong in a community? And there are so many ways of getting at that. And I think the other aspect of it that's so important is, how do you belong to a community, whether you're there for one day or for 1,000 years? You know, how do you have some kind of responsibility towards that place? Because yes, we all are transient and people are moving around. And how do we welcome people who are moving into our place from some other place who've lost everything? What would we want if we were moving from one place to another? So I don't have there are no answers to this really great question. It's a matter of opening ourselves up to asking it and understanding that these are the dynamics that we're all going to face, and having the compassion. You know, the whole thing about closing the borders, which drives me crazy, it's people who are wanting to close the borders, or people who usurped the native populations from this country, you know, from these borders to begin with, and who came from some other place themselves. So it's really just a common sense question of how you want to treat people who are coming here just the way you would like to be treated yourself, and probably weren't. Anyway, there's so much we can discuss in that regard, David. Thanks for the question. And I do write about it at some length in both Bringing the Biosphere Home and in this notion of cosmopolitan bioregionalism. I don't think I even said anything just now.
But you said it well. We had another comment from Lucy from that most important state, North Carolina. All eyes are on North Carolina. So make sure you unmute yourself. I think you.
There, yeah, I don't know what to say about that. You know, the difference between the two is 0.6 or something right now. So anyway, I'm checking in from Raleigh because I heard of Mitch through, Tyler, right? Tyler Volk, yeah. Anyway, I'm a big historian, and I'm an I'm an environmental educator who has now moved to preaching the whole story from the Big Bang to the future. And and I'm going to review Mitch's book for our journal. So I'm really glad I got to see this. I had hearing issues in the beginning, but I managed to scribble a lot. I'm just struck, and I just want to say thank you, Mitch, for writing this book. If you have lived the life, I mean, I'm 64, right? I lived everything you just talked about as an environmental educator. And I find convergent evolution or convergence that Sylvia in Seattle, I am focusing now when I teach big history I use nesting boxes. So it looks like this. You see this nested box. So this is the cosmos, and I use the sciences and the solar system and the planet and et cetera, et cetera. And this little purple box in the middle for the kids is, I put their picture on it. So they're in the center of the universe. And the future comes from individual brains mastering the nervous system. I didn't have that phrase, Sylvia, but that's exactly it. That's how we become non-Trumpites, to be crass, is we master our nervous system. Anyway, it all boils down to the future is completely dependent on how well this thing can control our nervous system. And that's the point that I'm making these days as a 40-year environmental educator. I've been, around the journey, and I used to do bugs, bunnies, and bullfrogs, but realized I wasn't changing society at all. So now I'm coming at it from another angle. So I just wanted to pipe in, say hello to you guys. You're in Connecticut? Anyone know of the
Most of
New
us.
Wildflower Society? I used to work there and stuff like that. But anyway, you all look like kindred spirits to me down here in North Carolina. So.
All right, well, make sure you get out there and make sure everyone vote correctly. Go ahead, Mitch.
Yep.
Well, I've not seen Lucy. We've talked on, I think we've spoken on the phone, and we've corresponded on the internet quite a bit, but I've actually never seen you in person. So it's great to meet you, and thanks for all the work that you're doing. And you might also, people may not be familiar with the term big history, so correct me if I'm wrong, but big history is a new approach to thinking about history in the grandest possible terms, a truly cosmic history. So that we take history out of several hundred years or 1,000 years or the Western European expansion and make it as big as we possibly can. And they have annual conferences and journals and books and all kinds of things. And so that's what Lucy's referring to when she says big history. So says my internet connection's unstable, but now it's not. Yeah. One of the things I'd like to say, which was prompted by your comment and Sylvia's comment, and I've been very influenced by a wonderful book by Robert Sapolsky called Behave, which is a huge human behavior discussion that ranges from the latest neurobiology, he's a neurobiologist, to organizational theory and sociology, a really magnificent book. And I agree with Sapolsky in the sense that I don't think that you can necessarily solve the issue of tribalism. I mean, there are evolutionary reasons why we tend to stick with our own and why we tend to exclude outsiders, but you can mitigate it. And you mitigate it by understanding the fact that you have those tendencies yourself. So there's a section in my book where I describe my own petty tribalisms, preferring New Yorkers to Bostonians. I mean, and so on, right? They're petty, and but they're there. And so, and they can get much worse. Not necessarily for me, but for many people, they can get much worse. And it's a very thin and slippery slope that takes you from looking at someone from New York and Boston as different, to looking at someone from, let's say, the United States and Mexico as different, to looking at someone who's white from someone who's black as different. And these are huge challenges that are big history challenges. So I think it's much more realistic for educators to think about how to mitigate those challenges by becoming more aware of them, as opposed to trying to eradicate them, which is just way beyond the scope of what's possible. But mitigation would be a wonderful first. And I think that's the kind of thing that Sylvia is doing through, the neurobiological, really asking good questions about behavior in school. These are mitigation techniques, and we need mitigation now on a range of different issues.
If I could put in a question, and Brian might want to talk about this from his Steep Rock perspective, and as well as Ken. But you mentioned that New England right now looks like a very safe place to live. We don't have the big fires. We have a lot of water. We get pretty good rainfall. consistently. Some years are drier than others, but pretty much we've got a lot of water here. We're not like the Southwest. We don't have earthquake issues that we talk about the way we've got over there on the West Coast. We don't have the hurricanes ferocity that you see in the Gulf. Yes, we have hurricanes, but they usually don't come up here with that kind of force. So if you're right about migration, and people are going to start to look to us as a destination, it's not going to happen next week, although we're actually seeing it right now. The realtors here are going crazy with all the people leaving New York and wanting to still be close to New York.
Wealthy people.
Yes, very much so. So housing prices are going up quite dramatically. Whether that is sustainable or these people will stay or they'll go back after a vaccine is, I think, a big question. But long term, what do you think communities should be doing? And I'm particularly thinking about land trusts who have taken the position, we want to preserve our towns, our areas the way they are. So that we gobble up land to preserve it, sort of keep it in a, almost like in a museum, if you will, when there could become high demand for living space. How do you think we should approach that problem or that conflict, potential conflict?
You're asking Brian this, yes?
Well,
Are you asking me?
I was curious if Brian had some thoughts on it, but Mitch, you also, because of your interest in migration.
Brian Hagenbeck?
Yeah, I'm still here.
You mean Brian? By the way, Brian is also a very gifted entomologist.
I think that it's a great question and one that sometimes keeps me up at night. I think that land trusts are really a community's way of self-determination on their environmental quality, so that we are made up of members of the community or people who are connected to that community, and we are trying to determine for the long term, in perpetuity, really the quality of life in that community. It's not just environmental, it's social, it's cultural, it's economic and such. That being said, the real conundrum is how do we do this, and how do we not come across as being showing kind of a structural form of racism or exacerbating the wealth divide, in that Steep Rock has over 25% of the town of Washington either in fee preserves or in easements, so protected in perpetuity. But we're also struggling with how do we deal with affordable housing. When I interviewed, they were talking about how do we deal with an elderly population, and then the pandemic hit and people were migrating up here from New York City, no longer as just coming up for weekends, but staying here permanently, and their impact on the community as well. So, and then when we had the tropical storm and we lost power for 8 days, they all moved back. But I think it's a real great question for land trusts to consider on the broader scale. How do we kind of shape that quality of life and yet become more inclusive and more participatory, and invite more people and diversity into the fold, and accept that and embrace what we do? So I'm not really answering the question. I'm saying that I have been thinking about it, and it's a real struggle.
Well, I think there's a role for land trusts to really go to our local politicians and try to get them engaged at a town level to say, how are we going to grapple with this? Because if we don't get ahead of it, it's still, the migration is going to happen and it's going to be handled poorly. At least that's my belief. If you fail to plan, you're going to fail.
Well, I think the problem in Washington is they've overplanned, and our zoning has basically locked everything out.
Well, okay. Well, I meant plan for the future migration. So
Yeah.
we've a little bit of denial about the flows that will happen if you take a perspective of the next 20, 30 years. We're going to see, I think, we should be prepared for changes in migratory flows. There's no guarantee, but you should be prepared.
No, absolutely, I agree there.
All right, anybody else? Kate did want to point out that the movie is My Octopus Teacher, and I would give it a 2 thumbs up for kind of understanding where we fit in the biosphere within all biology. We started out talking about us knowing each other, a couple of us knowing each other in elementary school. And again, our thinking back then, correct me if I'm wrong, we were so isolated from the environment we were in. The environment we lived in was a given, and it had no effect on us, and we had no effect on it. And now we see ourselves so tightly combined or intertwined with it. It really has been a dramatic journey for so many of us from where we were in the 50s to where we are now. To me, the only question is, are we learning fast enough?
Yeah, Ed, well, first of all, I want to say David Blockstein suggests The Soul of the Octopus by Cy Montgomery, which is in fact a great book. Cy lives in Hancock, New Hampshire, just over the hill. But there was something else that happened when we were very young that freaked me out and taught me about the close connections that we all have, and that is above ground nuclear testing. For those who are old enough to recall, they were actually testing nuclear weapons on the continental United States of America before the Test Ban Treaty. And then they were testing them out, in the Pacific atolls. And it didn't take much to figure out, even as a 6-year-old, that, oh my God, when you put your head down on the desk for an air raid, that's not going to help you. It's not going to help you. And that's when I learned not to trust people who necessarily were people in authority. I mean, it might sound crazy that I would have thought that at 6 years old. And that's when I learned also that, wow, this is an interconnected world we live in. One thing can go wrong and that's it. We're all done. Now, of course, it was just a kid's perspective on all of that. But for me, it represented a real place of fear, to the extent that if I heard a siren in the middle of the night, which is common in suburban Long Island, I turn on the radio to make sure it wasn't the end, right? So I think, going back to the beginning of the presentation, if you look at that picture of the Earth, that picture of the globe, when we first saw that picture from outer space, getting back to big history, Lucy, that was so wonderful. It was so brilliant because that globe became the icon, if you will. That became the transcendent icon for an entire generation of people who saw that as the jewel, the crown jewel that we all wanted to protect. So in many respects, we're still dealing with that same dilemma. On the one hand, we've got this beautiful planet. You still look at the Earth from space, get into the atlases, and it's just extraordinary. It's mind-boggling. It's unfathomable. And then on the other hand, you have all this stuff that's going on, these crazy apes with opposable thumbs who are buried in their phones, who are part of this. They're all part of it. But it's time to wake up, for all of us to wake up. I cannot tell you the amount of hours still to this day where I'm sleeping through it. I'm distracted by the screen. I'm not paying attention. And that's the point of the book, is that we all need to pay attention way better than we do to all of these things.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists, Abby Peklo and Ken Elkins, for helping out tonight and sharing their perspective. Of course, a very big thank you to Mitch for sharing his time and taking us through a fast walk through the book. So it sounds like there's a lot of excellent material in there that'll make it more than a one night read. I don't think it'll go that quickly, but I'm looking forward to it. And for those of you who are interested in future forums, I think you've seen the email greensanctuary@moosect.org. So if you want to just send an email, we'll put you on our mailing list. I want to thank everybody who's still with us. I know these Zoom meetings can be a little tiring, as Mitchell said at the beginning, but thanks for sticking with us, and hope you found it a useful evening. And let's go out and teach everybody about the environment. Thank you.